I want to welcome you to our message this week. So glad to have you here. I had a week off last week and looking forward today to sharing one final aspect about doing relationships love's way. As we've been looking through 1 Corinthians 13, more insights could certainly be found from this chapter, but next week we'll be starting into the Advent season and switching gears as far as the focus of our messages at that point in time. Here's a first observation that I want to share with you today, and that is this. America, really our world, the church and Christ followers have, to nobody's surprise, have lived through two fairly long years. We've lived through some economic upheaval, uncertainty about employment issues, political shouting matches, and a disease that has unexpectedly morphed numerous times in directions that nobody was predicting and in a way that has taken a toll on virtually all of us, either directly or indirectly. We have less confidence in our institutions that we have relied on throughout our lives. Our political and our government institutions have failed to do the right thing simply for the sake of doing the right thing, which is what we elect them to do. Our medical community has struggled to keep up with this pandemic, and our media on both sides have suffer from less trust than at any time in our lifetimes, I believe. And as a result of all of this, we're tired. I am. I think many of you are. A week ago Friday, Nancy and I were in the Twin Cities, and I needed to go to my mom's old bank, and I asked the teller how she was doing and if she had to work the following day on Saturday, and she said, "I am so ready for this week to be done. If I had to work tomorrow, that would be the last straw." Now, obviously, I don't know her whole story. I don't know if this was a typical week or a significantly more difficult week than average and all, but like a cell phone that is dying, whose battery doesn't have any charge left in it any longer, for this lady, there was nothing left in the tank. One more day seemed impossible. That's a very vulnerable place to be. All right, fatigue is dangerous, partially because when we're fatigued, it's hard to love people well. When we're fatigued, we don't protect ourselves well, and we have little to protect others with. We're less likely to receive love well. We're less likely to give out love to other people in a healthy manner as well. And an example that comes to mind regarding this is from one of the Old Testaments. Actually, it's one of its worst stories, I feel, okay? In the very same chapter, Genesis chapter 12, where God makes his covenant with Abraham very early on in his relationship with Abraham. Abraham and Sarah leave the land that they are in. They travel hundreds of miles, and after a brief period in the promised land, they continued down to Egypt to escape a famine in the land of Canaan. They have traveled an unbelievable distance for people from that time period, most of whom rarely traveled anywhere because traveling was unsafe, traveling was purposeless. They arrived in the land of Canaan where they had no meaningful support network, and they are running out of food for themselves and for whatever animals they may have had at that point in their lives. Abraham must have been exhausted from the journey that he was in. And then he is faced with this new problem as he heads down to Egypt. And the new problem is this. His wife Sarah is beautiful. And he has no idea how the Egyptians are going to respond to that. The example of Abraham and Sarah in this chapter ends up being the exact opposite of selfless love. The opposite of hoping for the best for the other person. The opposite of courageous love. In his tired and in his vulnerable condition, this is what Abraham decides to do. Genesis chapter 12, verse 11. As he was about to enter Egypt, we are told, he said to his wife Sarah, "I know what a beautiful woman you are. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is his wife.' Then they will kill me, but will let you live. So say that you are my sister, so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you." And sure enough, when they get into Egypt, Pharaoh himself, the king of Egypt, takes her into his palace to be his wife. I'm not saying that fatigue or that exhaustion were the primary causes for the way Abraham treated Sarah, but I believe that they would have been significant contributing factors. When we're tired, when we're stretched to our limits, we do not love particularly well because we are usually focused on our own survival, on our own self-preservation, on our own needs, not on the needs of others around us, not even sometimes the need of the most important person in our lives. Abraham does the opposite in this chapter of the last description of love that we're going to look at. 1 Corinthians 13, verse 7, where Paul simply writes this: "Love always protects." The word for protects here means to cover over something, to shield it from water, to cover over something like with a roof. It can also mean to endure silently, to put up with a long time. So one description of love I came across would be this: love has the strength to protect from outside threats as well as to protect from inner privileged contact. Abraham doesn't have the inner fortitude to do either in this story in Genesis chapter 12, and his lack of loving his wife well results in her being preyed upon by the Egyptian king. I wonder if he would have loved better if he had not been stretched to his limits, if he had not been fearing for his own life. We'll never know, but he stands as an example of how not to love in times of crisis or challenge or fatigue. Later in the message, we're going to come back to this example about Abraham, but here's what I want you to see right now. Sadly, I think that the fatigue of these last 2 years has made not just most Americans, but it has made many Christians more toxic in our words and in our attitudes. We're more bitter about politics. We're more bitter about the slant that is placed on the news by the media. We're more bitter about the public's pandemic response and how the government has treated that. Our social media posts seem angrier. We've become dangerous to others. We have lost our winsomeness. We're operating out of self-preserving fear, not other-protecting love. So I asked myself this question, as I've been trying to do throughout this look at 1 Corinthians 13, written after 12 opening chapters where Paul was addressing relationship problem after relationship problem after relationship problem in the church. And I asked myself this question as he was writing this phrase, "Love always protects." What was he thinking about? Imagine asking Paul, "Okay, Paul, protects from what?" And looking back at what Paul had already written about, I come up with a few conclusions. The first is this: I think he would have said, love protects from divisions that leave people wounded and isolated and feeling threatened. All right? The reason Paul warned them about division back in chapters 1 and chapter 3 was because lack of unity in the church will always damage whoever is within the vicinity of it. This is why Jesus' final prayer for his disciples in just a fantastic passage in John chapter 17 focuses on unity. In John 17, verse 11, Jesus prays to the Father, "Holy Father, protect them," talking about the disciples, "protect them by the power of your name, the name that you gave me, so that they may be one as we are one." During our Africa years, when we were missionaries there, the lead pastor at the main church in our city resigned to go and to study for his master's at a seminary in Africa, and the assistant pastor took his place. it was a fairly poor fit for him to take that role, and the leadership team soon faced nonstop crises. They eventually needed to confront the pastor about some troubling issues, and they ended up asking him to resign. Subsequent meetings then needed to focus on rebuilding from the damage, rebuilding from some of the hurt. But all of us in leadership, we were just worn out. The secretary of the leadership team, in a conversation that I had with him, the one who takes the notes, that takes the minutes at each of the meetings, he told me, he said, do you know in the last year we have had 66 leadership team meetings, stomping out the fires that had been created in the previous 12 to 18 months. And there was one particular meeting where it seemed like everybody's patience was really worn out. And in that meeting, someone said something along the lines of this: guys, Satan is winning the battle to divide us. We've all weathered the storm fairly well up until now, but now after the decision has been made and it's time for us to rebuild the church, our misplaced frustrations are doing more damage internally than the original crisis did practically, because now we're turning on each other rather than guarding our unity at all costs. Loving each other well during those months of regrouping, loving each other well meant protecting ourselves from ourselves. The exhaustion of those months led them to loving and protecting each other very poorly. Well, there's something else Paul might have had in mind, and that is this: love protects others by limiting the license that we take, or love protects others by limiting the freedoms that we could claim. Imposing self-limits. Here's what I mean. In 1 Corinthians 10, verse 23, Paul has written this: everything is permissible, but not everything is beneficial. Everything is permissible, but not everything is constructive. Nobody should seek his own good, but the good of others. So we know this is a significant problem because it doesn't just surface in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. It has already surfaced back in 1 Corinthians chapter 6. All right? My point here is this: there's a lot of freedom in the Christian life because the restraints, the constraints of the Old Testament law have been loosened, and because grace destroys the legalism that characterized so much of the Judaism of the time of Jesus. Paul is, in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, he is specifically discussing the question of whether Christians should eat meat that has been sacrificed to idols. And ultimately, in the big picture of things, he kind of comes down to this conclusion: this really isn't that big of a deal. It isn't as big of a deal as some people are saying. However, if there is a new believer for whom those idol sacrifices are still weighing on her, don't indulge, and by so doing, hurt her, damage her, cripple her in her newfound faith. A common modern day example might be this: an alcoholic comes to faith in Christ and gets freed from his alcoholism. His friends, Christian and non-Christian alike, his friends would be pretty unloving if they don't help protect him from falling into what for him has been a temptation toward drunkenness. All right? We don't seek just our own good. We seek the good of others, Paul has said. In other words, genuine love is willing to put my preferences behind everyone else's. In so doing, we protect and we honor. We love the other person in ways that are different from what we see in our culture. In effect, when I seek my own good without considering the fallout in other people's lives, the damage in other people's lives, I protect no one. And my love for them really doesn't exist. So perhaps to sum this up, we could say this: because my love protects, my freedom ends where your vulnerability begins. Because my love protects, my freedom, it ends where your vulnerability begins. And my candid assessment within the evangelical church over the past couple of years is this. We have lost significant ground in our relationship among and in our example in front of non-believers. Yes, some of the challenges that we are going through in America these days are because our culture has embraced a slippery slope away from Christian morals and Christian ethics. What more can we expect when the leadership team doesn't embrace Jesus Christ the way that we do? But some of our problem, some of the difficulties that we are having right now with those in positions of authority, with those in the media, with the government, is because we have, unwittingly, we have prioritized our political filter over our faith filter, over our spiritual filter, instead of the other way around. So a question I ask you is this: are you willing to evaluate your politics through the filter of faith rather than create a version of faith that supports your politics? Many in the evangelical church need to address that question very seriously. Political filters will not protect like faith filters. Political filters will not protectively love like spiritual filters. So let's return now to the story of Abraham, because it illustrates something that I first learned about in a 2004 book written by Gary Smalley called The DNA of Relationships. In that book, Gary makes the assertion that at the core of virtually every marriage crisis, really at the core of virtually all relationship crises, there is this truth: the external problem is rarely the real problem. The real problem is virtually always tied to what is our core fear. Ask someone in a marriage crisis, what do you think your spouse's greatest fear is? And they will pinpoint the core issue almost instantly and have a much better idea of how they need to change, how they need to alter their approach in that relationship with that person in a way that brings a healing within the relationship rather than a greater rift. One friend told me that because his wife's dad had walked away from their family when she was just 18 years old, throughout the first 18 years of their marriage, she feared that her husband would walk away too. That fear dominated her heart. Listen, it literally was when his protective love endured into their 19th year and into their 20th year that she was released from that crippling fear, and their marriage relationship went much deeper. He was totally unaware of the depth of control of her heart that fear had, because she remembered growing up in a Christian home like their Christian home was and seeing her dad walk away. Back again now to Abraham, Genesis 12:12. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, "This is his wife." Then they will kill me, but they will let you live. What is Abraham's core fear? That he's going to lose his life. And what results from that? He deceives the Egyptians, says, "No, she's not my wife, she's my sister." And he abandons his wife's fate into their hands. Hey, you want to know something? For as much as we respect and admire Abraham, and he is the father of the Jewish faith, and he is the patriarch that we revere as well, his protection of Sarah in this story looks similar to the protection of a sex trafficker. I'm just being honest. He is definitely not the poster boy for 1 Corinthians 13 type love. Now, years later, all right, while they were still waiting for a son, they ended up moving to a different country again. And we're not told, but what do you think were the dominating thoughts that Sarah had as they were once again leaving the land of Canaan and going to live in a nearby nation? Think she had any fears? Think she had any recollections of what transpired in Egypt? I'm convinced of this, that because Abraham was unwilling to love Sarah enough to protect her even at his own risk, even at the risk of losing his life, she had to have continued to live with even more crippling fear the second time around when, quite predictably, King Abimelech takes her to his palace as well after Abraham once again says, let's tell this guy as well that you're my sister and you're not my wife. I might be wrong in this, but Abraham is the worst example I can think of in the Old Testament, of a love that protects, of a 1 Corinthians 13 love that risks endangerment to myself by loving the other. And that leads me to a final principle, and that is this. Because what Sarah needed to be most protected from wasn't Pharaoh, and it wasn't King Abimelech. She needed to be protected from the worst of Abraham, the one who was closest to her, the one who should have loved her with his best. Love protects from the worst that is within me. That's the principle. Love protects from the worst that is within me. And usually that will mean that when we show a love that protects, we will pay a price ourselves. The worst in Abraham was cowardly self-preservation at the cost of leaving his life vulnerable to sexual slavery. He wasn't willing to pay the price himself. He was willing to let his vulnerable wife pay the entire price. That's not love. That is not doing relationships love's way. Author Phil Ryken summarizes it well when he says this: only the love of Jesus can empower us to keep on loving the people that it hurts for us to love, that it's dangerous for us to love. So let me close with just a few practical applications. If all of us wanted to grow in our understanding, in how we live out a love that protects, well, here's 3 things for 3 different groups. Ladies, my first one is to recommend that you read Ephesians 5, verse 33. And pay attention to the last line from it, which says, and the wife must respect her husband. Now, I know husbands don't always live in a way that's worthy of respect. I also know this: at times showing respect, is going to be sacrificial. It's going to be sacrificial. It's going to be hard. It's going to be risky. It could hurt. All right? But you are called to respect. There is no unless clause in this. You are called to respect, and to do that partially to protect your husband from your disrespect and the respect of children or others. And disrespect is one of the most wounding things that a wife can do to her husband. Change just that one aspect, and I believe you will see an improvement in your relationship with your husband. Guys, my guess is that if we took a poll of women, we would find that the majority of them would have their greatest fear being connected with abandonment or rejection. We live in a culture that is fueled by lust and the normalizing of sexual unfaithfulness, and that contributes to that fear. It provides fuel for that fear. Okay, so here's a suggestion. I would challenge you men to do what our youth pastor John Baker and I have done for many, many years, and that is submitted ourselves to having our phones and our computers being monitored by an organization called Covenant Eyes. All right, you can look it up. CovenantEyes.com is where you can go. It is a way to meaningfully love our wives by protecting them from the fears that I think are far more prevalent these days because we live in a porn-filled culture. And so anywhere I go on my phone, anywhere that I go on my computer, there is a report that gets generated to that gets monitored. It gets sent to, in my case, it gets sent to a couple of elders in our church, and they are able to see that report on a monthly basis. And if there is something there where I have access to a website that's inappropriate, then I have told them you have permission to come to me and to talk with me about that. Why not join us, guys? It's not like it's real expensive. $17 a month would be able to allow you to be able to provide something that will protect your wife's heart from what potentially is her greatest fear. You know your wife is worth that, and you know your wife would appreciate that. She would be blessed by that. And she would feel your protective love through that. And then the last word is to students, all right? Many years ago, a group of women that included my wife together with them, 15 to 20 of them, they were gathered and they were asked to describe Nancy Burg. And here is what the most common response to it was. They said, "When I am with Nancy, I feel safe." Nancy wasn't a gossip. Nancy didn't hurt other people with her words. Nancy was careful in what she communicated with other people around her. Kids, let that be your goal. Let it be your goal that when kids think of you, they say, "When I'm around him, when I am around her, I feel safe." Be the safest person that your friends text with. Be the safest kid on the team. Be the safest kid in the youth group. Be the safest kid on social media. That's doing relationships love's way. That is a love that protects others from the worst within you. And we know we're capable of doing things that are unkind and hurtful, things that can wound others. That is a love that is totally different from the love of the rest of the world. And if we do that kind of love well, I believe our world will notice. It's the love of Jesus. Let it shine, let it reflect out of how we live our lives as we protect others from the worst in ourselves and the worst in this world. Let's pray. So many relationships are being done so poorly these days, God. Our world, our lives, our families, our schools, they are littered with people who have been deeply wounded by others, with scars that don't seem like there's any hope for them to find healing. And sadly, God, I believe this to be true. I believe that there are Christians in churches all across our country, perhaps all over the world, who have contributed to some of that hurt. Through unwise things that we have said, through unwise things that we have posted, through angry responses to other people. And the world is waiting for somebody to do life different, to do relationships different, to show a different facet of love. They're looking for a love that's going to be protective. And may we as the church be the ones to step forward that say, we're going to do love Jesus' way. We're going to do relationships love's way. And we're going to protect them from the worst and bless them with the best. So enable us to do that, God. Forgive us for those times when unwise words, unwise comments, unwise actions have left behind us hurting and wounded people. Give us the ability, God, to go to some of those people, to mend those relationships and to ask forgiveness. And then reform us, refine us. Let us end up being the safest people that are out there, God. In Christ's name, I ask that. Amen. I hope you have a wonderful week. Thanks for joining us today. God bless you all. Live in a way that blesses others and doesn't hurt them. Amen.